All right. Hello, hello. So this will be module one of chapter one, where we're going to discuss various methods for knowing and for the acquisition of knowledge. And we will begin by considering the non-scientific approaches to knowledge acquisition. The approaches that are commonly used by ordinary people to make sense of reality. And then, once we're done with this module, we will consider the scientific method and how it differs from these non-scientific approaches. All right, so the first method that we'll consider is known as the method of tenacity. And this occurs when some claim is accepted as true on the basis of habit or superstition. This is also referred to as belief perseverance, when beliefs develop a sort of inertia simply because they've been around for a long time and have become deeply ingrained within a culture. There's even a finding in psychology known as the propaganda effect. And this is when we are more likely to evaluate a statement as true simply because we have heard that statement before. So, for example, if somebody tells you that pigeons hibernate in the winter, and then you hear the same statement being made again at some later point in time, you're more likely to agree with that statement simply because you have heard it before. Now, one explanation for why this happens is that statements that you've heard in the past may feel familiar, even if you don't remember hearing them. And people might mistake this feeling of familiarity as evidence that the statement is true. And of course, our culture is rife with various statements and claims and sayings that we've heard multiple times that have been repeated over and over and over, and that some people accept almost axiomatically. For example, take a statement like opposites attract. I'm sure we've all heard this idea that opposites attract. Now, there are a few problems with this statement. One problem is that it's very vague. What do we mean by opposite, given that people differ from each other across so many different dimensions? And later in the course, we're going to talk about the importance of using precise language when formulating a hypothesis, when making a prediction, etc. But secondly, when we look at the research, what we find is that when choosing friends, when choosing romantic partners, people actually prefer individuals with similar values, similar political leanings, similar religious beliefs, similar hobbies, similar age typically. So opposites might attract in chemistry, but with people, it's not quite so obvious that they do. Okay, or take the statement, old dogs can't learn new tricks. Now, it is the case that as we age, it does become harder to learn new information. I mean, this is especially true with something like language. I learned English when I was 6, and at the time it was very, very easy. I mean, I almost absorbed it automatically, at least that's what it felt like. However, my attempts to learn Spanish and Italian as an adult ran into some considerable obstacles. That being said, humans and dogs are capable of learning at any age throughout their life, although it may require more effort. Okay, so when it comes to the method of tenacity, I think it goes without saying that this approach is not very reliable. The fact that something has been believed for a long time by many people does not mean that it's true. It's often not clear from what source these ideas originate, and this method does not provide a mechanism for verifying or correcting false beliefs. All right, next we have the method of intuition. And this is when something is believed on the basis of a hunch, a gut feeling, because it feels right. And, look, we probably rely on this a lot in the context of ordinary decisions. What shirt to wear, what to eat for lunch, what movie to watch. All of these probably involve some degree of intuitive or emotional processes. And some psychologists would argue that all human decisions are informed by emotionality or intuitions, at least to some extent. For example, there's evidence that we rely on emotions when making moral evaluations. So if some person or some behavior evokes a feeling of disgust, even a subtle feeling of disgust, we may judge that person or behavior as being immoral and then perform all kinds of mental gymnastics to try and provide rational justifications for conclusions that were actually arrived at through these intuitive and emotional processes. Sometimes intuition involves, picking up subtle cues that people are giving off. For example, if somebody you know really well is having a bad day, you may be able to look at their face and just tell they're having a bad day without really knowing how you know or how you arrived at that conclusion. And in this situation, you're probably picking up on subtle cues, subtle changes in their voice, in their facial expression, in their posture, etc. So, sometimes intuitions lead you to correct conclusions, and sometimes they don't. I would say that intuition is at best an educated guess. However, the quality of that education is not always top tier. So I think intuitions may be somewhat more reliable if the following criteria are met. Number one, in domains where you have a lot of experience. And number two, if you are able to receive clear feedback about whether you are right or wrong. So, for example, when I was in grad school, I had to do a lot of programming. And after a while, I began developing certain intuitions. So if my script wasn't working, which happened very often, I might experience a hunch about what the problem might be without knowing why exactly that specific idea came to mind. And as I got more experience in programming, I think those hunches became more and more accurate. But programming is one of these fields where you get pretty clear, unambiguous feedback about whether something is working and whether your intuition is correct or incorrect. So you can know very quickly if your hunch is correct or not. Now, in ordinary life, I think people might overestimate the powers of their intuition because they may remember the hits, meaning all the times their intuition was right, but forget or discount the misses, all the times their intuition was wrong. And if you actually had some systematic way of keeping track of these data and computing a specific percentage that quantifies the accuracy of your intuitive powers, you may find that these powers are not as potent as you thought they were. And also, I think we should realize that our biases can often express themselves in the form of intuitions. For example, let's say you meet someone and suddenly get a bad feeling about them without really knowing why? Well, it could be the case that this bad feeling is actually caused by the person's age or their dress or their manner of speaking or their gender or their race or ethnicity or nationality or some combination of these factors. So this is one mechanism by which biases can subtly shape our behaviors and our attitudes. So look, intuition is part of human life, and I'm not saying you must ignore it and discount it at all times, but we should understand that intuitions are really automatic guesses that will often be distorted by our experience, our expectations, our biases, and our assumptions. All right, so next we have the method of authority. And this is when we get information or consult someone who's deemed to be an expert in some field. Now, this is often a fairly reliable way of getting information. This can give you a quick access to knowledge. And it's often very useful when you are first starting out and exploring the contours of a new area of research. However, again, while this is often a very useful way of getting knowledge, we should be aware of some of the problems and limitations that can arise when putting our trust in authorities. So first of all, it of course has to be said that all experts, no matter their eminence, no matter their accomplishments, no matter their CVs and number of publications, are at core human beings. And human beings are fallible. And human beings may have biases that can cloud their judgment and their ability to engage in an objective analysis of the data. And sometimes people will sort of blindly put their faith in authorities, almost in a manner that resembles dogma or something religious more than something scientific. Now, here's another problem. So, one question you may ask when thinking about the experts is, do the experts agree with one another? In other words, is there consensus within some field? And sometimes, in some areas, there may be consensus. There may be agreement between the experts and very little debate or controversy. However, in other issues, it is often the case that there's not consensus among the experts, especially in areas of active scientific research. There may not be very much consensus. There may be disagreements. There may be warring factions that are battling over theories and interpretations of data. So then if you have a situation where the experts disagree, then which expert do you choose? Whose opinion do you prioritize, and on what basis, right? That's a problem. Another issue to consider is that expertise does not transfer very far. From what we know, looking at data on these questions, is that if you take an expert and you begin moving them outside their field of expertise, that expertise starts becoming less and less relevant, less and less reliable. Expertise really is only applicable within a fairly narrow domain. And it kind of reminds me of an old limerick. There once was a fellow from Esser, whose knowledge grew lesser and lesser, then at last got so small he knew nothing at all, and now works as a college professor. Anyway, so yes, choosing an expert can be very tricky. For example, let's say you are looking for an expert in color vision or color perception. And suppose you come across me and you look at my resume and I have a PhD. Wonderful. And my PhD is in psychology and neuroscience. Great. And furthermore, I have a background in visual perception. And you think, fantastic, this is my guy. I found my expert in color vision. Well, I would have to disappoint you because I am not at all an expert in color vision. Visual perception is a very broad field that has all kinds of subdisciplines and subdisciplines of subdisciplines. And so my research never really overlapped with color vision. That's not what I studied. So I would not call myself an expert. I probably know more than the average person. I can probably give you a decent introductory lecture on the basics of color vision. But if you need an expert, I am not the person. And so this just gives you an example of the challenges that can arise when trying to find somebody that's actually an expert in what you need them to be an expert in. All right, and so here we have some checks on authority that your book proposes for you to consider. So for example, evaluating the expertise and the relevance of the expertise. Somebody may be an expert, but does their expertise really overlap with the question that you are trying to answer? Next, see if you can determine whether what you're being told is a fact or an opinion. Experts have opinions, but opinions are not facts. See if you can evaluate the consistency between what you're being told and what is already known and established to be true. Seek multiple opinions and see whether there is consensus between the experts. And of course, be cautious with information that you get online and make sure that your sources are reputable and verified. All right, so next we have the rational method. And this is when we seek answers through the process of logical reasoning. And this logical reasoning will often take the form of something called a syllogism or a deductive argument. And this is when you have a set of premises that are logically combined to yield some conclusion that again is derived from those premises. Now, when evaluating a syllogism, there are two important concepts that have to be considered. One is validity and the other is truth. So validity, an argument, a syllogism, is said to be valid if the conclusion follows logically from the premises. Okay, that is a valid argument. And we'll look at some examples of valid and invalid syllogisms in the next few slides. Now, the second concept or question about a syllogism is its truth. Is the conclusion actually true? Does the conclusion represent anything in observable, knowable reality? And here it has to be understood that just because a syllogism is valid, that does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is true. You can have a perfectly valid syllogism that gives you a nonsense conclusion that is completely false with respect to reality. All right, so let's consider this example, this syllogism. Premise 1 states that all humans are mortal. Premise 2 states that Socrates is a human. And the conclusion is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, let's evaluate this syllogism. So again, premise 1 tells us that all humans belong in the category of mortal beings, right? All humans are mortal. Premise 2 tells us that Socrates is a human. Socrates falls into the category of humans. And so the conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal, follows logically from the premises, meaning this is a valid argument. So if these premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And we can see that here. Socrates must be mortal if he's a human and if all humans are mortal. Now, is this true? Well, yes, we know that it's true because we know that human beings are mortal, right? Now, notice the truth of the conclusion is not derived from the syllogism itself. It must be derived externally. All right, let's consider this example. Premise 1 states that all birds can fly. Premise 2 states that penguins are birds. And the conclusion is, therefore, penguins can fly. So first, let's evaluate the validity of this syllogism. So premise 1 tells us that all birds fall into the category of things that can fly, right? All birds can fly. Premise 2 tells us that penguins are birds. Penguins fall into the category of birds. Therefore, the conclusion, therefore penguins can fly, is valid. This is a valid syllogism, meaning if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. It follows logically from the premises. If penguins are birds, and if all birds can fly, therefore penguins must also have the ability to fly. However, is this true? Well, of course, we know that it's not true. Okay? Anyone that knows anything about penguins knows that for all of their wonderful qualities, flight is not one of them. So here we run into one of the problems with the deductive method. The deductive method depends on the truth of the premises. And if there's a flaw in the premise, the conclusion may be valid, but not true. And so in this case, the first premise, all birds can fly, makes an assertion that is not correct and will lead you to a conclusion that is also incorrect. All right, one more example here. Let's look at this one. So premise 1, all students are tired. Premise 2, some tired people are irritable. Conclusion, therefore, some students are irritable. Let's begin by looking at the validity of this argument. So premise 1 tells us that all students fall into the category of tired people, right? All students are tired. Premise 2 tells us that some tired people are also irritable, meaning there's some overlap between tired people and irritable people. However, these premises don't tell us whether students fall into this overlap or not. Therefore, this is not a valid argument. The conclusion does not follow logically from the premises. The conclusion is not proven by the premises. The premises don't tell us whether students fall into this region or not. However, this is tricky because the conclusion feels like it's true. It's a reasonable thing to believe that some students probably are irritable. And so here's an example of an argument that is not valid, but with a conclusion that may nonetheless be true, or at least very plausible. And so here we have to be careful when evaluating the logical integrity of an argument, not to be tricked by conclusions that may sound plausible and may make us believe that an argument is valid when in fact it's not. So the limitations of the rational method, firstly, as we saw, logical conclusions are valid if the premises are true, and syllogisms simply assume that the premises are true. And sometimes premises are not true, in which case you will arrive at a conclusion that may also not be true. And if you get to choose your premises, you can make logical arguments in favor of almost anything. So that's a problem. How do you know if the premises are true or not? You have to look outside the syllogism. And also, just people are not phenomenal in their ability to engage in rigorous logical reasoning. There are a lot of logical fallacies, both formal and informal, and being able to spot them does require some training and practice, often considerable amounts of training and practice. All right, and lastly, we have the empirical method. Now here we have to be a little bit careful with the words because sometimes people will call science an empirical method. But here we're referring to something a little bit different. So we are talking about this, the idea of empiricism. And this is an old kind of philosophical school of thought that attempts to answer the question of where knowledge comes from. And in this debate, there were kind of two sides, the rationalists and the empiricists. So rationalism states that knowledge is derived primarily through reasoning, deductive reasoning, for example. Or knowledge may be innate. Maybe we are born with certain categories of knowledge. On the other end of the ring were the empiricists who claimed that no, actually knowledge comes primarily or entirely through the senses by exploring and experiencing the world around us. So here the empirical method is referring to knowledge that is gained through the sensory apparatus, sensory experiences. So let's talk about some limitations of the senses. One, our observations may be misinterpreted. What we perceive is not as objective as we may think it is. Our sensory experience can be swayed by beliefs and assumptions and expectations. The senses are limited. We perceive only a tiny fraction of all the energy that is out there in the physical world. Also, when we talk about something that we experienced, oftentimes we are talking about something that we experienced in the past. We are talking about a memory of an experience. And we know that memories are not that reliable. They can fade and also change as time goes by. But also, the senses can be tricked. They can be fooled and deceived in many different ways. Let's look at some deceptions of the senses. Are these lines the same length or not? Your eyes probably say no, one is longer, but your eyes are lying. Here, are these two green lines the same size, the same length? Again, your eyes, I assume, tell you no, when in fact, the answer is yes, they are the same size. These two panels appear to be very different shades of gray. This appearing to be much darker than this one down here. But I have news for you. They're actually exactly the same shade of gray. What about these two tables? Surely these tabletops are different shapes and different sizes, right? The red and the green. Well, let's take a look. All right, we'll turn this and look at that. They are exactly the same size. All right, so in this module, we talked about various non-scientific ways of acquiring knowledge. For example, the method of tenacity, believing based on habit or superstition. The method of intuition, when you believe something on the basis of a hunch or a feeling. The method of authority, when you rely on experts in the field to guide you and tell you what is true and what isn't. Rationalism, the rational method, when you rely on logical reasoning and the deductive method to derive conclusions from premises. And finally, empiricism, when you rely on direct sensory observation to form conclusions about the world. And we saw some of the problems that arise when relying on each of these methods. So in the next module, we're going to talk about the scientific method, which is a more formal, a more rigorous way of interrogating nature and trying to make sense of what is or isn't true in the world.